Hello, dear history travelers, and welcome back to another journey into the shadows of the past. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend your time here with me today as we explore some of history's most perplexing mysteries. Stories of power, intrigue, and disappearances that remain unsolved centuries later. Before we descend into these fascinating and sometimes chilling tales of vanished rulers, I want to ask for a small favor. If you enjoy these deep explorations into history's greatest mysteries, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and click that notification bell. Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten and mysterious stories back to life. Also, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me which historical mystery you'd like us to investigate next. Every comment is read, and your suggestions truly shape our content. Now, find somewhere comfortable, perhaps dim the lights a little, and prepare to enter a world where kings could vanish as completely as morning mist, where power offered no protection against mysterious fates, and where the truth has remained hidden for hundreds of years. Let's discover what happened on the days when kings disappeared. Imagine being the most powerful person in your kingdom. You command armies, dispense justice, and your word is law. You're surrounded by guards, courtiers, and servants who attend to your every need. Your movements are documented, your actions recorded by chroniclers. You are, quite literally, the center of your world's attention. Now imagine vanishing. Not dying in battle with witnesses to record your final moments. Not succumbing to illness with physicians noting your symptoms. Not being publicly executed with crowds watching. Just disappearing. One day you exist, the next you're gone, and no one can definitively say what happened to you. This seems impossible, doesn't it? How could the most visible, most documented, most protected person in an entire kingdom simply vanish without a trace? And yet, throughout medieval history, this happened again and again. Kings, princes, heirs to thrones, people whose every movement should have been witnessed and recorded, simply disappeared, leaving behind only questions, theories, and centuries of speculation. Some vanished in moments of crisis, during battles, coups, or political upheavals when chaos provided cover for sinister deeds. Others disappeared in circumstances that should have been safe and controlled, making their fates even more mysterious. Some bodies were never found. Others were found but couldn't be definitively identified. And in some cases, the official story was so obviously false that it created more questions than answers. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are real people whose fates remain unknown. Families who never learned what happened to their loved ones. Kingdoms that were thrown into chaos by the sudden absence of their rulers. These disappearances changed the course of history, sparked wars, ended dynasties, and created legends that persist to this day. Today, we're going to investigate some of the most compelling cases of vanished medieval rulers. We'll examine the evidence, what little exists, and explore the theories about what really happened. We'll meet the princes in the tower, two boys who entered a fortress and were never seen again. We'll discover the fate of King Sebastian of Portugal, who rode into battle and was never found among the dead. We'll investigate the mysterious disappearance of Owen Glendower, the Welsh prince who simply faded into the mist. And we'll explore several other cases where powerful rulers vanished in ways that still baffle historians. Some of these stories have partial answers, bodies that might be theirs, theories that seem plausible. Others remain completely unsolved, with no credible explanation for what happened. All of them reveal something profound about the precariousness of power, the violence lurking beneath medieval society's surface, and the limits of historical knowledge. So, prepare yourself for a journey into uncertainty, into the gaps in the historical record where truth has been swallowed by time. We're entering the realm of the disappeared, medieval rulers who stepped out of history and never returned. We begin with perhaps the most famous disappearance in English history, a case that has generated more theories, investigations, and controversy than almost any other: the vanishing of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, known to history as the Princes in the Tower. The year is 1483. King Edward IV of England has just died unexpectedly at age 40, leaving behind two young sons. Edward, the eldest, is 12 years old enough to be king but too young to rule alone. Richard, his brother, is 9. These boys are the rightful heirs to the English throne, the continuation of the Yorkist line that had fought so hard to claim the crown during the Wars of the Roses. What happens next has been debated for over 500 years. The boys' uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is appointed Lord Protector, essentially regent until young Edward V comes of age. Richard brings the boys to London, to the Tower of London, which was then a royal residence as well as a fortress and prison. The Tower was where kings traditionally stayed before their coronation. Everything seems to be proceeding normally toward Edward V's crowning. But then Richard makes an extraordinary claim. He declares that his brother Edward IV's marriage to the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was invalid, because Edward had been pre-contracted to marry another woman. If the marriage was invalid, then the boys are illegitimate, and if they're illegitimate, they can't inherit the throne. Parliament accepts this claim, though how freely they accepted it versus how much they were coerced is debatable. Richard is declared the rightful king and is crowned as Richard III. The two boys, no longer princes but officially declared bastards, remain in the Tower. And then, in the summer and fall of 1483, people stop seeing them. At first, the boys were visible to Londoners. They were seen playing in the Tower gardens, shooting arrows, appearing at windows. But gradually, these sightings became less frequent. By late summer, they were moved to inner chambers. By autumn, no one reported seeing them at all. No announcement was made, no official explanation was given. The boys simply ceased to appear. They were not released, they were not publicly executed, they were not officially acknowledged as being dead, they were just gone. The historical sources from this period are frustratingly vague and contradictory. Some contemporary writers reported rumors that the boys had been murdered. Dominic Mancini, an Italian visitor to England, wrote that the boys were seen less and less frequently and believed to be dead by the end of 1483, but he had no proof, only rumor and speculation. The most detailed account of what allegedly happened comes much later from Sir Thomas More's History of King Richard III, written in the 1510s, decades after the events. More claimed that Richard III ordered the boys murdered, and that they were smothered with pillows as they slept. He even named the alleged murderers, Sir James Tyrrell, and two servants, Miles Forrest and John Dighton. More's account became the standard story, especially after Shakespeare dramatized it in his play Richard III, cementing Richard as a monstrous uncle who murdered his innocent nephews. But there are serious problems with More's account. First, he was writing 30 years after the events, during the reign of Henry VIII, whose father, Henry VII, had overthrown Richard III. More had every political reason to portray Richard as a villain. Second, More's source for the story was probably John Morton, Bishop of Ely, who had been Richard's enemy and had fought against him. This is hardly an unbiased source. Third, No bodies were produced at the time to prove the boys were dead. So, what actually happened? Let's examine the possibilities. This is the traditional story. Richard wanted to secure his throne, and as long as the boys lived, they represented a potential rallying point for his enemies. Even if they were officially declared illegitimate, some nobles might still support their claim. The safest course was to eliminate them. Evidence for this theory. Richard had motive and opportunity. The boys disappeared while in his custody during his reign. He never produced them alive after rumors of their deaths began circulating, which he certainly would have done if he could have. He never explained what happened to them. Evidence against. No bodies were ever produced during Richard's lifetime. No trial or official announcement of their deaths was made. Richard was known to be religious and had shown mercy to other potential rivals in the past. Would he really murder 2 children, one of whom he had sworn to protect? Henry Tudor invaded England in 1485, defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and became Henry VII. Some historians argue that the boys might have survived Richard's reign but were murdered by Henry VII, who would also have seen them as threats. Evidence for this. Henry never produced the boys either. If they had been alive when he took the throne, producing them would have strengthened his position by showing he was merciful and legitimate. His failure to do so is suspicious. Evidence against. The boys seem to have disappeared in 1483, 2 years before Henry took the throne. Contemporary sources were already reporting them as likely dead during Richard's reign. If Henry killed them, he would have been killing boys who had already been declared illegitimate and who posed little threat to him. Some theorists argue that the boys might have escaped or been secretly removed from the tower, either to protect them or for other purposes. Evidence for this. The boys' mother, Elizabeth Woodville, emerged from sanctuary and allowed her daughters to go to Richard III's court, which some argue she would never have done if she believed Richard had murdered her sons. Perhaps she knew they were alive somewhere. Evidence against. No credible sightings of the boys after 1483 exist. The pretenders who later claimed to be Richard, Perkin Warbeck, were almost certainly frauds. If the boys had escaped, someone would have come forward with them eventually. Some theorists argue that the boys might have died of illness, plague, tuberculosis, or some other disease, and their deaths were concealed because it was politically convenient for various parties to leave the mystery unsolved. Evidence for this. Childhood mortality was high in the medieval period. Death by disease was common. The tower could be an unhealthy place. Evidence against. If they died naturally, why wasn't this announced? Even if Richard feared being blamed, a public funeral and display of the bodies would have settled the matter. The complete secrecy suggests something more sinister than natural death. In 1674, nearly 200 years after the boys disappeared, workmen renovating the Tower of London discovered a wooden box buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. King Charles II, believing these to be the remains of the princes, had them interred in Westminster Abbey in an urn designed by Christopher Wren. The Latin inscription on the urn identifies them as Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. But were they really the princes? In 1933, the bones were briefly examined by experts who concluded they were consistent with children of the right ages, around 10 and 12. However, the examination was limited and non-invasive. In 1987, a more thorough analysis suggested the elder child might have been older than Edward V was at his disappearance, raising questions about the identification. Modern scientists have called for DNA testing, which could potentially prove or disprove whether these are the princes by comparing DNA with known relatives. However, the Church of England and Westminster Abbey have so far refused to allow such testing, arguing that the remains should not be disturbed. This refusal has fueled continued speculation. Are these really the princes? If they are, how did they die? The bones showed no obvious signs of violence, but smothering wouldn't necessarily leave marks on bones. If they're not the princes, whose bones are they, and where are the real princes? The disappearance of the princes in the tower remains unsolved for several reasons. First, no one with direct knowledge left a credible, unbiased account of what happened. Everyone who wrote about it had political motivations to lie or distort the truth. Second, the physical evidence is ambiguous. The bones in the tower might be the princes, but we can't be sure without testing that hasn't been allowed. No other remains have been found. Third, all the potential suspects are long dead, and the trail has gone cold for over 5 centuries. New documentary evidence is unlikely to emerge at this point. Fourth, the case has been so politicized and dramatized over the centuries that separating fact from propaganda is nearly impossible. Shakespeare's Richard III is a brilliant play, but terrible history. The Tudor dynasty that defeated Richard had every reason to paint him as a villain. Later Ricardian societies have had every reason to defend him. The truth is buried under layers of political narrative. What we know for certain is this: 2 young boys entered the Tower of London in the summer of 1483 and were never seen again. Someone knows what happened to them, or knew at the time, but that knowledge died with them. The boys' fate remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries, a disappearance that changed the course of English history and continues to fascinate us over 500 years later. The princes in the tower represent the archetype of the vanished medieval ruler, children of supreme rank who should have been protected by their status, but instead found that their royal blood made them targets. Their disappearance reminds us that in the brutal world of medieval politics, even children weren't safe, and the most powerful positions could become death sentences. Now let's travel south to Portugal and forward in time slightly to 1578 to meet a king whose disappearance created one of the most enduring legends in European history, a myth so powerful that it gave birth to a word: Sebastianism, the belief that the lost king would someday return to save his nation. King Sebastian I of Portugal was born in 1554, the grandson of King John III. His father died before he was born, and his grandfather died when Sebastian was 3, making the toddler king of Portugal. He grew up under the regency of his grandmother and various advisors, raised to believe he had a divine mission to expand Christianity and Portuguese power. By all accounts, Sebastian was a complex and troubled young man. He was deeply religious to the point of fanaticism. He had little interest in women or marriage, despite the urgent need for him to produce an heir. He was obsessed with military glory and dreamed of leading a great crusade against the Muslim powers of North Africa. Sebastian's advisors tried to dissuade him from his crusading ambitions. Portugal was not militarily or financially strong enough for such an adventure. The age of crusades had passed. The Ottoman Empire and its allies were formidable powers, not easy targets for conquest. But Sebastian was convinced that God would grant him victory, and in 1578, at age 24, he gathered an army and sailed to Morocco. The force he assembled was substantial, perhaps 20,000 men, including Portuguese soldiers, German and Italian mercenaries, and Moroccan allies. Sebastian's goal was to place his ally Muhammad al-Mutawakkil on the throne of Morocco extending Portuguese influence in North Africa. On August 4th, 1578, Sebastian's forces met the army of Abd al-Malik, the current Sultan of Morocco, at a place called Alcácer Quibir in Portuguese, or Qasr el-Kebir in Arabic. The resulting battle was an absolute disaster for the Portuguese. The Moroccan forces vastly outnumbered Sebastian's army. Estimates suggest they had 50 to 60,000 men. The battle was fought in intense heat, and the Portuguese were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. By the end of the day, the Portuguese army had been destroyed. Thousands were killed, and thousands more were captured for ransom. 3 kings died in or shortly after this battle: Abd al-Malik, who died of illness during the fighting; Mohammed al-Mutawakkil, Sebastian's ally, who drowned trying to escape; and supposedly King Sebastian himself. The battle became known as the Battle of the 3 Kings. But here's where the mystery begins. Sebastian's body was never definitively identified. According to official Portuguese accounts, Sebastian died in the battle, fighting bravely to the end. His body was supposedly found on the battlefield, brought back to Portugal, and buried with royal honors. Case closed. Except that many Portuguese people didn't believe it. The body returned to Portugal was badly decomposed and difficult to identify. The face was unrecognizable. Some who had known Sebastian well said it didn't look like him. Others who saw the body said it could be anyone. Moreover, there were good political reasons why various parties might want to fake Sebastian's death. Portugal was in crisis. Sebastian died childless, and the succession fell to his elderly great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, who was elderly, in poor health, and had taken vows of celibacy as a Catholic cardinal, meaning he couldn't produce an heir. Within 2 years of Sebastian's disappearance, Cardinal Henry would be dead, and Portugal would fall under the control of Philip II of Spain, losing its independence for 60 years. Some Portuguese nobles and officials might have preferred to believe Sebastian was alive and would return, rather than accept the catastrophic reality that his death had delivered Portugal into Spanish hands. And so the legend of Sebastian's survival was born. Rumors spread that Sebastian hadn't really died at Alcácer Quibir. Some said he'd been captured and was being held for ransom in Morocco. Others claimed he survived the battle but was wounded and had gone into hiding. Some even suggested he had a religious experience during the battle and retired to live as a hermit in North Africa, doing penance for the disaster he had caused. These rumors persisted for decades, and multiple pretenders emerged claiming to be the lost king. The first appeared in 1584, a young man who claimed to be Sebastian and gathered followers in Portugal. He was captured and executed. Another pretender appeared in 1585, this one in Venice. He too was eventually caught and punished. The most famous pretender was Gabriel de Espinosa, a pastry cook who appeared in Spain in 1594, claiming to be Sebastian. He had supporters among Portuguese nobles who wanted to overthrow Spanish rule and restore Portuguese independence. But he was captured, tried, and executed in 1595. Despite these failed pretenders, belief in Sebastian's survival persisted. This became known as Sebastianism, the messianic belief that King Sebastian would return in Portugal's hour of greatest need to restore the nation to glory. This wasn't just a fringe belief, it was embraced by many Portuguese across all classes. Sebastianism took on almost religious overtones. Sebastian became a mythical figure, a sleeping king who would wake when Portugal needed him. He was compared to King Arthur of Britain, who legendarily would return to save England. Prophecies circulated about when and how he would return on a misty morning, riding a white horse to lead Portugal to greatness. This belief had real political consequences. During the Iberian Union, when Spain controlled Portugal, 1580 to 1540, Sebastianism provided ideological support for Portuguese nationalism and resistance. When Portugal finally regained independence in 1640, some saw it as the fulfillment of Sebastianist prophecies, even though Sebastian himself didn't return. Sebastianism persisted well into the modern era. Portuguese explorers and colonists who emigrated to Brazil carried the belief with them. In the 19th century, Sebastianist movements arose in rural Brazil, with charismatic leaders claiming Sebastian would return to create a paradise on earth. The most famous was Antonio Conselheiro, who led a Sebastianist community that the Brazilian government eventually destroyed in a brutal military campaign in 1897. Even today, Sebastianism survives as a cultural touchstone in Portuguese and Brazilian culture, representing hope for deliverance, a belief in a messianic return, and a certain melancholic longing for past glory. But what actually happened to King Sebastian? Despite the legends, the most probable explanation is that Sebastian died at Alcázar Quibir, and the body returned to Portugal was indeed his, even if it was badly decomposed and difficult to identify. Multiple sources confirm his death. Moroccan sources reported finding his body on the battlefield. Portuguese survivors of the battle reported seeing him fighting in the thick of the battle, where he would have been an obvious target. The body that was returned had items of Sebastian's clothing and jewelry. The difficulty in identifying the body is easily explained by the desert heat and the time between death and recovery. Bodies decompose rapidly in such conditions. After several days in the Moroccan summer, any corpse would be difficult to identify definitively. The political motivations for doubting his death, Portugal's succession crisis, the desire to resist Spanish control, explain why people wanted to believe he'd survived, not why he actually had. Wishful thinking and political desperation are powerful forces. The pretenders who claimed to be Sebastian were almost certainly frauds. None had credible evidence of their identity, and all were eventually exposed as impostors. That 4 different pretenders appeared suggests not that Sebastian survived, but that the psychological need to believe he had survived was so strong that multiple people attempted to exploit it. The persistence of Sebastianism tells us something important about how disappearances become legends. Sebastian's physical disappearance, the difficulty in identifying his body, the distant location of his death, the lack of witnesses who could definitively confirm what happened, created space for doubt. But the psychological and political factors were even more important. Portugal faced catastrophic consequences from Sebastian's death: loss of independence, subordination to Spain, economic decline. Believing he might return was psychologically easier than accepting that his foolish crusade had destroyed Portuguese sovereignty. Sebastian became a symbol of Portuguese identity and independence precisely because his disappearance coincided with Portugal's loss of independence to Spain. He was transformed from a reckless young king who led his nation to disaster into a messianic figure who would return to restore national glory. This is a pattern we see repeatedly with disappeared rulers. They become more powerful in absence than they were in life. The mystery of their fate allows people to project their hopes, fears, and political aspirations onto the vanished figure. The disappeared king becomes a legend precisely because his disappearance leaves an empty space that legend can fill. Sebastian of Portugal disappeared on a Moroccan battlefield in 1578, and in doing so, he became immortal, not through achievements in life, but through the power of his absence. His body vanished into the confusion of battle and has haunted Portuguese culture ever since, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful legacy a ruler can leave is the mystery of their disappearance. From the battlefields of Morocco, we return north to the misty hills and valleys of Wales, to meet a prince whose disappearance is so complete, so mysterious, that we don't even know what year he died, let alone how or where. This is the story of Owen Glendower, known in English as Owen Glendower, the last native prince of Wales, who led a fierce rebellion against English rule and then vanished as completely as morning mist. Owen Glendower was born around 1359 into Welsh nobility. He was well educated, possibly studying law at the Inns of Court in London, and he served in the English army, fighting in Scotland and elsewhere. He owned estates in Wales and seemed to be a prosperous, integrated member of the Anglo-Welsh gentry. Nothing about his early life suggested he would become the leader of a national uprising. But in 1400, a property dispute with an English neighbor escalated into something much larger. Owen appealed to the English Parliament for justice and was ignored. Frustrated and angry, and recognizing that he represented broader Welsh grievances against English rule, Owen raised the banner of rebellion. On September 16, 1400, Owen was proclaimed Prince of Wales by his supporters. What began as a property dispute transformed into a full-scale war of Welsh independence, and for more than a decade, Owen led a remarkably successful rebellion that came close to driving the English out of Wales entirely. At the height of his power, around 1404-1405, Owen controlled most of Wales. He held parliaments, formed alliances with France and Scotland, England's enemies, crowned himself Prince of Wales with formal ceremony, and established the apparatus of an independent Welsh state. He signed treaties as a sovereign prince. He planned to establish Welsh universities. For a brief, glorious moment, Wales had its own independent ruler again, the first since the English conquest a century earlier. But then the tide turned. Henry IV of England and his son, the future Henry V, launched systematic campaigns to reconquer Wales. Owen's French allies failed to provide sustained support. One by one, the Welsh castles fell back into English hands. By 1410, Owen was a fugitive, leading a guerrilla war from the mountains, his cause clearly lost. And then he vanished. The last definite record of Owen Glendower is from 1412, when he was mentioned in a document as still at large. After that, nothing. He simply disappears from the historical record as completely as if he'd never existed. There was no announcement of his death, no body was ever found or identified as his, no burial site was recorded, no witness came forward with a credible account of his final days. The English, who had been hunting him for years, never captured him or confirmed his death. He just faded away. Various theories had been proposed about what happened to Owen in his final years. The most prosaic explanation is that Owen, now elderly, in his 50s, old for the medieval period, sick from years of hard campaigning and seeing his cause lost, went into hiding with loyal supporters and died there, possibly at one of his daughter's homes. His supporters buried him secretly to prevent the English from desecrating his body. Evidence for this is simple and plausible. Many of Owen's family and supporters remained alive and unpunished, which might have been the price for their cooperation in allowing him to disappear quietly. A secret burial would explain why no grave has been found. Evidence against: surely someone would eventually have revealed the location of his grave, especially after memories of the rebellion faded. The complete absence of any bed-death scene, burial record, or local tradition about his grave is suspicious. Some sources suggest that Owen retired to a monastery, possibly the Cistercian abbey of Abbati cum Hir in Powys, and lived out his final years as a monk under an assumed name. Evidence for this was a traditional way for defeated noblemen to end their lives. Retiring to religious life allowed them to exit political life without execution or ongoing persecution. Monasteries could be discreet about the identities of their residents. Evidence against: no monastery has ever claimed to have housed Owen, even centuries later, when such a claim would have brought prestige rather than danger. Monastic records, while not complete, should have some trace of such a notable person if he really lived as a monk. Perhaps Owen was betrayed, captured, and quietly executed by the English, who then concealed his death to prevent him from becoming a martyr. Or perhaps he was killed by disillusioned followers or Welsh rivals, who then hid the deed. Evidence for the English had every reason to want Owen dead, and every reason to conceal his execution. A public execution would have made him a martyr. Disappearance left his supporters in uncertainty. Secret murder and burial would explain the complete absence of records. Evidence against: the English generally preferred public executions of rebels as deterrents to others. When they captured and executed Owen's son Gruffydd, they made it very public. Why would they hide Owen's death? Some romantic theories suggest Owen escaped to France or Scotland, living out his days in exile under protection of England's enemies. Evidence for both France and Scotland had supported Owen during the rebellion. They might have given him sanctuary. This would explain why neither Welsh nor English sources record his death. It happened in a foreign country. Evidence against: foreign sources don't mention him either. If Owen had appeared at the French or Scottish courts, it would have been noted. He was too prominent to simply disappear into foreign exile without any record. What makes Owen's disappearance particularly mysterious is the complete absence of even rumors or stories about his fate. When important people die, stories circulate. People claim to have been present. Traditions develop about burial sites. Local legends emerge. But with Owen, there's almost nothing. A few vague suggestions about monasteries or hiding places, but no coherent tradition. No credible account. It's as if he literally evaporated. This has led some Welsh historians to suggest that the disappearance was deliberate and carefully managed. Owen's closest supporters knew what happened to him, but kept it secret so successfully that the knowledge died with them. This level of operational security is impressive if true. Dozens of people would have needed to keep the secret for their entire lives. Like King Sebastian, Owen's disappearance made him more powerful in death than he had been in life. Because there was no confirmed death, no grave, no final defeat, Owen could live on in Welsh imagination as an undying hero. Legends arose that Owen wasn't dead but sleeping, like Arthur, waiting to return when Wales needed him. Prophecies circulated that he would wake and lead Wales to freedom. Centuries after his disappearance, Welsh rebels and reformers invoked his name and claimed his mantle. This is precisely what his disappearance accomplished. It transformed a defeated rebel into an eternal symbol. If Owen had been captured and executed, he would have been a martyr, but a dead one. If he had simply died in bed and been buried, he would have been a noble failure. But by disappearing, by leaving his fate uncertain, he remained alive in possibility, forever on the verge of returning. Today, Owen Glendower is a national hero in Wales. Statues honor him. Streets and buildings bear his name. He's taught in schools as the great Welsh freedom fighter. His disappearance is part of his legend, the prince who wouldn't give the English the satisfaction of a confirmed death, who walked into the mists and became part of Welsh mountains and valleys themselves. Modern Welsh nationalism often invokes Owen's memory. The fact that he succeeded for a time in creating an independent Welsh state and that his final fate remains mysterious makes him a powerful symbol of Welsh resilience and identity. In 2000, the 600th anniversary of the start of Owen's rebellion, Wales celebrated with commemorations throughout the year. In 2008, a movement emerged to make September 16, the date Owen was proclaimed Prince of Wales, an official Welsh holiday. Owen's disappearance, far from diminishing him, has made him immortal in Welsh culture. The most probable explanation is the simplest. Owen Glendower, an old man whose cause was lost, retired to a safe house provided by supporters, possibly one of his daughter's homes, and died there quietly around 1415–1416. His body was buried on an unmarked grave on the property, and his supporters kept the secret to protect both Owen's memory and themselves from English retribution. Over time, everyone who knew the truth died, and the location of the grave was forgotten. No marker had been placed, so even if someone later wanted to reveal it, they couldn't. This scenario requires no elaborate conspiracies or dramatic events. It's just an old rebel dying quietly and being buried discreetly, with his followers gradually taking the secret to their own graves. But the very ordinariness of this explanation is why the legend persists. Owen Glendower deserves, in the imagination of those who admire him, something more dramatic than a quiet death in bed. His disappearance without trace allows for something more mysterious, more romantic, more fitting for the last native Prince of Wales. And so Owen remains disappeared, not just from life, but from historical certainty. A prince who led a rebellion, established a state, and then walked into the Welsh mists and became part of Welsh mountains and valleys themselves. His vanishing was so complete that even now, over 600 years later, we cannot say with confidence where he died or where he's buried. He is history's ghost, forever present in Welsh memory, precisely because of his absence from the historical record. Now let's travel to the heart of medieval Europe and meet another disappeared ruler who became a legendary sleeping figure, Frederick I, Holy Roman Emperor, known as Barbarossa, Redbeard, who vanished beneath the waters of a river in Anatolia and supposedly never died at all. Frederick Barbarossa was one of the most powerful rulers of the 12th century. He became Holy Roman Emperor in 1155 and spent his long reign, 1155 to 1190, trying to reassert imperial authority over Italy, fighting wars against the papacy and Italian city-states, and attempting to centralize power in the vast, fractious Holy Roman Empire. He was, by all accounts, a formidable figure, physically imposing, politically astute, militarily successful. His red beard became his emblem, and he cultivated an image as a stern, just ruler in the tradition of Charlemagne. He was respected by allies and feared by enemies. In 1189, at nearly 70 years old, an extraordinary age for the medieval period, Frederick embarked on the Third Crusade alongside Philip II of France and Richard I of England. Frederick led a massive German army overland through the Byzantine Empire and into Anatolia, aiming to reach the Holy Land and recapture Jerusalem from Saladin. The campaign was difficult. The army had to march through hostile territory, dealing with both Byzantine Greeks who distrusted the Crusaders and Turkish forces who harassed them. But Frederick's army was making progress, winning several battles and approaching the Holy Land. On June 10, 1190, the army reached the Salef River, modern Göksu River, in Anatolia, near the city of Silifke, in what's now southern Turkey. It was a hot day, and the river looked inviting after a long march. What happened next has been the subject of debate for over 800 years. The basic facts are these. Frederick Barbarossa entered the river and drowned. But the details of how this happened are murky and contradictory. Different sources give different versions of Frederick's death. Some say he was trying to cool off and went swimming but was swept away by the current. Others say he was fording the river on horseback when his horse stumbled, throwing him into the water. Some claim he had a heart attack or stroke while in the water. Still others suggest he was wearing armor and drowned because of its weight. Most sources agree that his death was sudden and unexpected. He was apparently healthy that morning. Then he entered the river, and minutes later he was dead or dying. His body was recovered quickly. It's not like he was lost in the river. The accounts describe his corpse being pulled from the water, efforts to revive him failing, and his death being confirmed. So far, this sounds like a tragic but straightforward drowning, not a mysterious disappearance. But here's where it gets strange. What happened to his body next is unclear and contradictory. According to the plan, Frederick's body was supposed to be preserved and taken to Jerusalem for burial in the Holy Sepulchre. It was an honor for a crusader to be buried in the Holy Land. The Crusaders attempted to preserve the body through various methods. Some sources say it was boiled to separate the flesh from the bones, a common medieval practice for transporting bodies. Others say it was pickled in vinegar. But the preservation didn't work well in the Anatolian heat. The body began to decompose badly. The Crusaders were forced to bury the flesh somewhere in Anatolia. Sources disagree on exactly where, with some saying Tarsus, others saying Antioch. The bones were supposedly transported separately. And then the bones seem to have disappeared. Some sources say they reached Jerusalem and were buried there. Others say they were buried in Tyre. Still others claim they were lost en route. No grave site has been definitively identified. No tomb exists that everyone agrees contains Frederick Barbarossa's remains. To this day, we don't know where Frederick Barbarossa is actually buried. The exact location of his remains is unknown. This uncertainty about Frederick's burial, combined with the shocking suddenness of his death, just when his crusade seemed on the verge of success, created perfect conditions for legend. Within a few generations of Frederick's death, stories began to circulate in Germany that he wasn't really dead at all. According to these legends, Frederick was sleeping inside a mountain, usually identified as either the Kyffhäuser or Untersberg mountains, sitting at a stone table with his red beard growing through it. He would sleep until Germany needed him, at which point he would wake and return to restore the empire to glory. This legend became enormously popular in German-speaking lands. It was similar to the King Arthur legend in Britain or the Owen legend in Wales, the sleeping king who would return. The legend said that ravens flew around the mountain, and when they stopped flying, Frederick would wake. His beard had to grow 3 times around the stone table before the time came for his return. The legend was so powerful that it influenced actual politics. During the German nationalistic movement of the 19th century, the sleeping Barbarossa became a symbol of German unity and power. When the German Empire was finally unified under Prussian leadership in 1871, some saw it as the awakening of Barbarossa's dream. Interestingly, the legend originally attached to Frederick's grandson, Frederick II, another Holy Roman Emperor who had an eventful life. But over time, the legend transferred to Barbarossa, perhaps because his red beard made him more visually distinctive, or because his death was more mysterious. Unlike our other cases, Frederick Barbarossa almost certainly died when sources say he did, on June 10, 1190 in the Salif River. Too many witnesses were present, too many contemporary sources recorded it, and his death caused immediate and obvious consequences. His Crusader army largely fell apart without his leadership, for it to have been faked. The mystery isn't whether he died, but what happened to his body afterward. And even that has a probable explanation. It was buried in pieces in multiple locations due to failed preservation attempts, and over the centuries, the exact locations were forgotten or the graves were destroyed. Medieval record-keeping was spotty, especially during military campaigns in foreign lands. That we've lost track of exactly where a body was buried in 1190 isn't particularly mysterious or surprising. What's interesting about the Barbarossa case is that the legend of his survival developed even though his death was well documented. This shows that disappeared ruler legends aren't always about actual mysterious disappearances. They're about psychological and political needs. Germans in later centuries wanted a symbolic figure of German power and unity. Barbarossa, a strong emperor from a time when Germany was powerful, fit that need. The fact that his burial site was unknown allowed the legend to develop. If there had been a prominent tomb where people could visit and confirm his death, the sleeping legend might not have taken hold. The legend filled a political vacuum. During the medieval period, the Holy Roman Empire was weak and fragmented. During the early modern period, Germany was divided into hundreds of small states. Barbarossa represented a time when Germany had been unified under a strong emperor. Believing he would return was psychologically more comforting than accepting that such unity was gone forever. Frederick Barbarossa's case teaches us that even relatively well-documented deaths can become mysterious through the erosion of specific details. We know he died in 1190, but the uncertainty about what happened to his body created space for legend. It also shows how political and cultural needs shape the stories we tell about disappeared rulers. Barbarossa became a sleeping king not because he literally disappeared, but because people wanted him to be one. The legend served a purpose, giving hope to those who longed for German unity and power. In this sense, Barbarossa's disappearance was constructed after the fact, created by selective memory and wishful thinking. His physical body vanished not in the moment of death, but gradually over the centuries, as burial records were lost and the exact locations forgotten. And in that gradual vanishing, a legend was born. Frederick Barbarossa drowned in a river in Anatolia in 1190, but in German imagination he never died at all. He sits in his mountain, beard growing through stone, waiting to return and restore Germany to greatness. His physical body may have disappeared into unmarked graves, but his symbolic presence has never left German culture. He is simultaneously the best documented and most legendarily disappeared ruler we've examined. Proof that even certainty can become mystery given enough time and enough desire to believe. We've examined cases where rulers genuinely disappeared, leaving uncertainty about their fates. Now let's explore a related phenomenon, the pretenders who appeared after rulers vanished, claiming to be the disappeared king returned. These cases tell us as much about the power of royal disappearance as the original vanishings themselves. We touched on Lambert Simnel briefly in our earlier script about kings without kingdoms, but his case is worth examining in detail because it shows how disappeared rulers could be impersonated. Edward, Earl of Warwick, was the son of George, Duke of Clarence, brother to Edward IV. He was a legitimate Yorkist heir to the English throne, which made him dangerous to Henry VII, who had seized the throne in 1485. Henry kept the young earl imprisoned in the Tower of London to neutralize him as a threat. In 1487, a boy appeared in Ireland claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, supposedly escaped from the Tower. The boy was actually Lambert Simnel, the son of an Oxford tradesman, coached by a priest named Richard Simons to impersonate the Earl. Lambert was crowned King Edward VI in Dublin, and an invasion of England was launched to put him on the throne. The invasion failed at the Battle of Stoke Field, and Lambert was captured. Here's where the story gets interesting. Henry VII produced the real Edward, Earl of Warwick, from the Tower, proving that the pretender was a fake. But Henry then did something clever. He didn't execute Lambert. Instead, he gave him a job in the royal kitchens, first as a spit-turner and later as a falconer. Why? By keeping Lambert alive and in a humiliating position, Henry demonstrated both mercy and contempt. The message was, this pretender is so obviously false, so pathetically unimportant, that I can afford to let him live as a servant. It was a political masterstroke. But it also reveals something important. The real Edward, Earl of Warwick, was still alive in the Tower, yet someone had successfully impersonated him and gathered support for a rebellion. If a prisoner who was provably still alive could be impersonated, imagine how easy it was to impersonate genuinely vanished rulers. The case of Perkin Warbeck is even more complex and mysterious. As we discussed in our earlier script, Warbeck appeared in the 1490s claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower, supposedly murdered along with his brother in 1483. Warbeck's story was that assassins had killed his brother, but spared him, spiriting him away to the continent where he was raised in secret. Now, as a young man, he was ready to reclaim his throne from the usurper Henry VII. What makes Warbeck's case fascinating is how credible he was. He convinced multiple European monarchs to acknowledge him as the real Richard. Margaret of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV and aunt to the real Richard, declared him genuine. He received support from France, Scotland, and the Holy Roman Empire. Warbeck looked and acted like a prince. He spoke English with an aristocratic accent. He knew details about the royal family. He had courtly manners. For nearly a decade, he was treated as a legitimate English prince by much of European royalty. Was he Richard? We'll never know for certain. Under torture after his capture, Warbeck confessed to being the son of a Flemish boatman named Jan de Werbeck. But this confession came under duress, so its reliability is questionable. He was executed in 1499, taking the truth with him. The Warbeck case demonstrates the power of disappeared rulers. They create vacuums that can be filled by pretenders, and in the absence of the real person, proving or disproving such claims becomes almost impossible. Let's move east to Russia for an even more dramatic case of pretenders exploiting a mysterious death. In 1591, Tsarevich Dmitry Ivanovich, the young son of Tsar Ivan the Terrible and heir to the Russian throne, died mysteriously in the town of Uglich. The official investigation concluded he had an epileptic seizure and accidentally stabbed himself in the throat while playing with a knife. This seems unlikely. Many Russians suspected that Boris Godunov, who would soon become Tsar himself, had Dmitry murdered to clear his own path to the throne. Dmitry's death was suspicious, and no one quite believed the official story. This created perfect conditions for pretenders. In 1404, a young man appeared in Poland, Lithuania, claiming to be Dmitry, who he said had survived the assassination attempt through substitution of another child. This false Dmitry first gathered Russian supporters opposed to Boris, invaded Russia, and actually succeeded in becoming Tsar in 1605. He ruled for about a year before being overthrown and killed by boyars, Russian nobles, in 1606. His body was publicly displayed, burned, and the ashes shot from a cannon to prevent any further claims of survival. But that didn't stop the pretenders. A second false Dmitry appeared in 1607, claiming to have survived the 1606 murder.
He gathered an army, besieged Moscow, and established a rival government. He was eventually killed by one of his own men in 1610. Then a third false Dmitri appeared, and then others. For years, men kept claiming to be the supposedly miraculously surviving Dmitri, and people kept believing them because the original death had been so suspicious and the body had been difficult to identify. The false Dmitri phenomenon shows how disappeared or suspiciously dead rulers create opportunities for pretenders, and how political dissatisfaction can make people willing to believe even implausible claims of survival.
Returning to England, the uncertain fate of the princes in the Tower generated not just one, but multiple pretenders. We've mentioned Perkin Warbeck, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, but there were others. A man named John de Warbeck claimed to be Edward V in the 1490s. In 1499, a man named Ralph Wilford claimed to be the Earl of Warwick, who was actually alive in the Tower, making this claim particularly bold or stupid. Even into the 16th and 17th centuries, occasional pretenders appeared claiming to be one of the princes miraculously survived. None were credible, but they kept appearing because the true fate of the princes remained unknown. These pretender cases are important for understanding disappeared rulers for several reasons. First, they show that royal disappearances created tangible political opportunities. When a ruler vanished without a confirmed death, the uncertainty could be exploited by those seeking power or by foreign powers seeking to destabilize a kingdom. Second, they demonstrate that medieval people were both credulous and skeptical about such claims. Some pretenders attracted significant support, suggesting that belief in the survival of disappeared rulers was widespread. Yet most were eventually exposed and punished, showing that there were also robust mechanisms for testing such claims. Third, they reveal that the line between genuine belief and knowing fraud was often blurry. Did Margaret of Burgundy really believe Perkin Warbeck was her nephew Richard, or did she support him because it was politically useful to challenge Henry VII? Did Warbeck himself believe he was Richard by the end, or was he always a conscious fraud? These questions may not have clear answers. What motivated pretenders to make these dangerous claims? Some were clearly put up to it by others. Lambert Simnel was coached by Richard Simons, a priest with his own political agenda. He was a child who probably didn't fully understand what was happening. Others might have been con artists seeking money, power, or adventure. Claiming to be a missing prince could bring wealth and status, at least temporarily, even if it usually ended badly. Some might have actually believed they were the person they claimed to be, either through delusion or because they'd been told stories from childhood that they were actually a prince in hiding. This psychological phenomenon, where someone comes to believe a false identity, is well documented in modern psychology. Medieval pretenders might have experienced the same thing. And some might have been caught between belief and fraud, starting out knowing they were imposters, but gradually being convinced by their own performances and by their supporters' faith in them. Foreign powers often supported pretenders as tools of diplomacy in warfare. Scotland supported Perkin Warbeck to pressure England. France and Burgundy backed various pretenders for their own political purposes. Poland-Lithuania supported the first false Dmitri to gain influence in Russia. These powers might not have truly believed in the pretenders' identities, but supporting them was politically useful. A credible pretender could destabilize an enemy kingdom, extract concessions from the current ruler, or serve as a pawn in larger diplomatic games. This cynical use of pretenders shows how disappeared rulers became political tools even after death. Their uncertain fates created opportunities that savvy politicians exploited. The phenomenon of pretenders appearing after rulers disappeared teaches us several things about medieval politics and psychology. It shows how important lineage and bloodline were to legitimacy. In a world where divine right and hereditary succession were the primary bases for political authority, claiming the right bloodline could grant instant legitimacy, at least to some audiences. It demonstrates the power of wishing thinking. People wanted to believe that beloved or legitimate rulers had survived, so they were willing to believe claims that may have been objectively implausible. The desire for a particular political outcome made people credulous. It reveals the limits of medieval information and verification. In a world without photographs, DNA testing, or centralized records, proving someone's identity was difficult. If a person looked approximately right, acted the part, and knew some details that the real person would know, they might successfully impersonate a disappeared ruler, at least for a time. Finally, it shows how disappeared rulers haunted politics long after their physical vanishing. Every appearance of a pretender reminded people of the original disappearance, kept the mystery alive, and demonstrated that the uncertainty created by the vanishing had ongoing political consequences. The pretenders are shadows cast by the disappeared, echoes of the uncertainty created when rulers vanished without trace. They prove that royal disappearances weren't just historical events, but ongoing political phenomena that shaped events for generations after the original vanishing. We've examined several specific cases of disappeared rulers. Now let's step back and analyze the patterns. Why did medieval rulers disappear? What circumstances made such disappearances possible? And what do these cases tell us about medieval politics and power? Almost all of our disappeared rulers vanished during moments of political or military crisis. The princes in the Tower disappeared during a usurpation and succession crisis. King Sebastian vanished in the chaos of a lost battle. Owen Glendower disappeared as his rebellion failed. Frederick Barbarossa died during a crusade far from home. This isn't coincidental. Crisis creates the conditions for disappearances in several ways. First, during chaos, normal record-keeping breaks down. The bureaucratic apparatus that usually documents a ruler's movements and fate becomes disrupted. This creates gaps in the historical record that make disappearances possible. Second, crisis provides cover for foul play. If someone wants to murder a ruler, a battle or political upheaval is the perfect opportunity. The death can be blamed on the crisis itself rather than on deliberate action. Third, crisis creates confusion about what actually happened. Multiple contradictory accounts emerge, witnesses disappear or die themselves, and establishing the truth becomes difficult or impossible. Fourth, crisis creates political incentives to obscure the truth. Various parties may benefit from uncertainty about the ruler's fate, leading to deliberate suppression or distortion of information. Many disappeared rulers were in vulnerable positions when they vanished. The princes in the Tower were children who had lost their father and protector. Edward, Earl of Warwick, was a prisoner. Owen Glendower was a defeated rebel. These weren't rulers at the height of their power, but people whose positions had become precarious. This pattern suggests that royal disappearances often involved foul play. When rulers were vulnerable, their enemies could act against them with less risk and less resistance. A powerful, well-protected ruler, surrounded by loyal supporters, is difficult to make disappear. A child in custody, a prisoner, or a defeated rebel is much easier. The vulnerability pattern also explains why disappearances were possible. A ruler at the height of their power is highly visible, constantly attended, and difficult to conceal. A ruler who has lost power or hasn't fully gained it yet is less visible, less protected, and easier to hide or eliminate. Several of our disappeared rulers died or disappeared far from their home territories. Frederick Barbarossa died in Anatolia, far from Germany. King Sebastian vanished in Morocco. Owen Glendower might have died hiding far from his home estates. Distance from home made disappearances easier in several ways. First, it meant fewer local witnesses who knew the person well and could confirm their identity or fate. When Frederick died in Anatolia, most of the witnesses were fellow crusaders who might not have known him personally. When Sebastian died in Morocco, identifying his body among thousands of battlefield dead was nearly impossible. Second, distance made transporting and preserving bodies difficult. We saw this with Frederick Barbarossa, whose body decomposed before it could be properly preserved and transported. When bodies can't be brought home for public viewing and burial, confirming death becomes harder. Third, distance meant that news traveled slowly and could be distorted in transmission. By the time reports reached home, the trail was cold, witnesses had dispersed, and reconstructing what happened was difficult or impossible. Fourth, distance provided opportunities for deception. If you wanted to fake a ruler's death or survival, doing so far from home where verification was difficult made sense.
Many disappeared rulers vanished at moments when their death created or exacerbated succession crises. The princes in the Tower disappeared precisely when their removal benefited their uncle Richard III. King Sebastian's disappearance created a succession crisis that ended with Portugal losing independence to Spain. Owen Glendower's disappearance left Welsh resistance without a clear leader. This pattern suggests that succession politics often played a role in royal disappearances. When multiple parties had interests in either confirming or denying a death, information became weaponized. Some parties wanted the ruler dead and gone. Others wanted to believe or claim the ruler survived. The truth got lost in these competing political narratives. The succession crisis pattern also explains why some disappeared rulers became legendary sleeping kings. When their death created political chaos or unwelcome succession outcomes, people wanted to believe they weren't really dead and would return to fix things. This wishful thinking transformed historical disappearances into enduring legends. Medieval people lacked the tools we take for granted for identifying the dead. No photographs, no fingerprints, no dental records, no DNA testing. Identifying a corpse, especially one that was decomposed, damaged, or found among many others, was difficult. This inadequacy made disappearances possible in two ways. First, it meant that bodies might not be definitively identified even when they were found. Was that decomposed corpse really King Sebastian? The body returned to Portugal was badly damaged and couldn't be confirmed as his with certainty. Was that skeleton really Frederick Barbarossa? Bodies buried during the chaos of military campaigns often went unidentified. Second, it meant that false claims about survival or death were difficult to disprove. If someone claimed a ruler was dead but couldn't produce a definitively identified body, skeptics could doubt the claim. If someone claimed a ruler survived but was in hiding, proving the negative was nearly impossible. The limitations of medieval identification technology created space for uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, disappearances became possible and enduring. Finally, we must recognize that some disappearances persisted because uncertainty served someone's political interests. Multiple parties might benefit from not resolving what happened to a vanished ruler. For example, with the princes in the Tower. Richard III might have benefited from ambiguity.
If they were secretly dead, they couldn't threaten his throne, but if he didn't admit killing them, he avoided the moral condemnation of child murder. Henry VII, who succeeded Richard, also benefited from ambiguity. If the princes were dead, they couldn't challenge his throne, but he could use the mystery to blacken Richard's reputation. Various factions could use uncertainty to support pretenders when politically useful. With Owen Glendower, the English benefited from uncertainty. They didn't have to admit they never caught him, but they also didn't have to make him a martyr with a public execution. Welsh supporters benefited from uncertainty. It allowed them to believe he might return, maintaining hope and resistance. When multiple powerful parties benefit from not resolving a disappearance, the truth can remain hidden indefinitely. The conspiracy of silence isn't necessarily coordinated. It emerges from the convergence of different parties' interests in maintaining uncertainty.
Synthesizing these patterns, we can identify the conditions that made medieval royal disappearances possible. Crisis and chaos that disrupted normal documentation and created confusion. Vulnerability of the ruler who disappeared, making them easier to eliminate or lose track of. Physical distance from home and witnesses who knew them well. Succession politics that motivated various parties to conceal or distort the truth. Inadequate identification methods that made confirming deaths difficult. Political incentives to maintain uncertainty rather than resolve it. When several of these factors converged, a ruler could vanish even though they should have been the most visible, most protected, most documented person in their realm. These disappearances reveal important truths about medieval politics. First, power was more fragile than it appeared. Even kings could be eliminated surprisingly easily when circumstances aligned. The elaborate ceremonies and sacred aura surrounding monarchy didn't actually protect rulers from violence when powerful people wanted them gone. Second, information was difficult to verify and easy to manipulate. In a world without mass media, photography, or modern forensics, controlling the narrative about what happened to someone was relatively easy. Truth was what powerful people said it was. Third, political legitimacy was both crucial and contingent. The disappearance of legitimate heirs could create succession crises that lasted generations. Yet, illegitimate rulers could sometimes maintain power despite questions about their legitimacy. The system valued bloodline and legitimacy in theory, but accepted effective power in practice. Fourth, the boundaries between life and death, presence and absence, could be surprisingly permeable for political purposes. A ruler might be physically dead but politically alive, through pretenders or legends of return, or physically alive but politically dead, imprisoned and forgotten. The binary of alive-dead was complicated by political considerations. Finally, mystery and uncertainty themselves became forms of political power. Disappeared rulers haunted politics long after their physical vanishing. The questions about their fates influenced events, inspired movements, and shaped how people thought about legitimate authority. In some cases, the disappeared were more powerful in absence than they had been in life. We've examined medieval disappearances and the patterns they reveal. Now let's explore how modern technology and historical methods have attempted to solve these ancient mysteries and why some remain stubbornly unsolved. Modern forensics and the princes in the tower. The most sustained modern investigation into any medieval disappearance involves the princes in the tower. As we discussed earlier, Bones were discovered in 1674 that might be the princes. These bones have been examined multiple times using increasingly sophisticated methods. The 1933 examination by medical and dental experts concluded the bones were consistent with children aged approximately 10 to 13 and 12 to 15. This roughly matched the ages of the princes at their disappearance, 9 and 12. Both sets of remains showed signs of belonging to related individuals. No obvious signs of violence were present. However, this examination had serious limitations. It was brief, non-invasive, and based on techniques that we now know were imprecise. Modern forensic anthropologists have noted numerous problems with the 1933 conclusions. A 1987 reanalysis of photographs and records from the 1933 examination suggested the age estimates might have been too imprecise to definitively match the princes. One set of bones might belong to a child older than Edward V was at his disappearance. The bones might not even be from the same historical period. Without DNA testing, definitive identification is impossible. This brings us to the great frustration of the Princes in the Tower case. The bones are sitting in Westminster Abbey, and modern DNA testing could potentially solve the mystery definitively, but the testing has not been allowed. DNA testing could work like this. Extract DNA from the bones in Westminster Abbey, compare it to DNA from confirmed relatives of the princes, determine whether the bones are actually the princes. We have good potential DNA sources for comparison. Richard III's skeleton was discovered in Leicester in 2012 and has been extensively studied. Richard was the prince's uncle, sharing their bloodline. Living descendants of the family also exist who could provide comparative DNA samples. So why hasn't this testing been done? Several reasons. First, the Westminster Abbey and the Church of England have generally opposed disturbing remains interred in the abbey. They consider it disrespectful to the dead and a violation of sacred space. This is a principled position based on religious and ethical considerations. Second, some argue that even DNA evidence might not be conclusive. If the bones aren't the princes, we're back to having no idea what happened to them. If they are the princes, we still won't know who killed them or exactly how they died. The mystery would be partially but not fully solved. The debate over testing the bones continues. It represents a fascinating clash between historical curiosity, scientific capability, ethical considerations, and political and reputational concerns. The mystery could potentially be solved, but we collectively choose not to solve it. Modern historians and archaeologists have also investigated King Sebastian's disappearance, though with less concrete evidence to work with. Portuguese and Moroccan researchers have attempted to identify the exact location of Sebastian's burial. Multiple sites in Morocco have been proposed. A chapel in Qasr el-Kebir, where his flesh was supposedly buried, a church in Fez where some remains were taken, various unmarked graves from the battlefield. Some remains supposedly belonging to Sebastian were brought back to Portugal and interred in the Jerónimos Monastery in Lisbon. But whether these are actually Sebastian's remains has never been definitively established. In 2003, Portuguese researchers proposed exhuming and DNA testing the remains in Lisbon. However, this proposal was not approved. As with the Princes in the Tower, there's reluctance to disturb historic burials, especially when the results might be inconclusive. The battlefield of Alcácer Quibir has been surveyed by archaeologists looking for mass graves from the battle. Some graves have been found and excavated, revealing remains of soldiers from the battle. But identifying any specific individual from these remains is almost impossible without extensive DNA testing of all remains and comparison to known descendants. The most likely conclusion remains that Sebastian died in the battle as reported, and his remains are buried somewhere in Morocco, but have been lost to time and inadequate record-keeping. But without definitive proof, the mystery technically remains unsolved.
Owen Glendower's disappearance has also attracted modern investigation, though with even less physical evidence to work with. Welsh historians and amateur investigators have proposed numerous possible burial sites. Monnington Straddle in Herefordshire, at the home of his daughter, various churches and monasteries throughout Wales, secret locations in the Welsh mountains, even Westminster Abbey, based on a probably false rumor. Archaeological digs have been conducted at some proposed sites, but no remains have been found that could plausibly be Owen's. This isn't surprising. If Owen was buried in secret, the burial would have been simple and unmarked, making discovery centuries later nearly impossible. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey techniques have been used at some sites, but without more specific information about where to look, finding a 60-year-old unmarked grave is like finding a needle in a haystack. The Glendower case illustrates the limits of modern technology when faced with complete historical silence. Without contemporary records of where someone was buried, and without physical remains to test, even sophisticated modern techniques can't solve the mystery. The search for Frederick Barbarossa's remains has been complicated by the multiple proposed burial sites. The Cathedral of Tyre in Lebanon, now destroyed, supposedly contained his bones. The Church of St. Peter in Antioch, also destroyed, was another possibility. Jerusalem was mentioned in some sources. Modern researchers have searched records and surviving structures in these locations, but no definitive evidence of Barbarossa's burial has been found. The various churches and cathedrals that might have contained his remains have been destroyed, rebuilt, or altered so many times over 800 years that finding any specific burial from the 12th century is extremely difficult. Unlike the princes in the tower, there isn't even a set of remains that might be Barbarossa's to test. The mystery of his burial location remains completely unsolved, though the fact of his death is not seriously in doubt. Despite modern technology and methods, several of our cases remain unsolved. Why? Lack of physical evidence. The most fundamental problem is that we often have no physical evidence to work with. No bodies have been found that might be Owen Glendower or Frederick Barbarossa in the locations they supposedly died. Without remains to test, modern forensics can't help. Even when we have remains, like the bones in Westminster Abbey, we face the ethical and political problem of whether to test them. The capability exists, but the will or permission doesn't.
Medieval record-keeping was spotty, especially during times of crisis. Many documents that might have explained what happened to disappeared rulers have been lost, destroyed, or never existed in the first place. Modern historical methods can re-examine surviving sources, cross-reference accounts, and apply critical analysis to separate likely truth from propaganda. But we can't create evidence that doesn't exist. When the historical record is silent or contradictory, even the best historical methods can only outline possibilities, not determine certainties. Political and cultural sensitivities. Some mysteries remain unsolved, partly because various groups prefer to maintain uncertainty. Richard III's reputation, Portuguese national identity, Welsh cultural legends, these all have stakeholders who might oppose investigations that could challenge cherished beliefs or narratives. This isn't necessarily cynical or dishonest. people genuinely disagree about whether solving these mysteries is worth the potential costs, disturbing remains, challenging cultural narratives, or spending resources on historical questions when modern problems need attention. The nature of proof. Finally, some mysteries may be inherently unsolvable even with modern technology. Even if we definitively identify the remains of the princes in the tower, we won't know who killed them or exactly how unless we find contemporary documentary evidence explaining it. Even if we find Owen Glendower's grave, we won't necessarily know the circumstances of his death or why his burial location was concealed. Modern technology can answer some questions. Whose bones are these? When did this person die? But it can't always answer the larger historical questions about circumstances, motivations, and meanings. Is it a problem that some medieval disappearances remain unsolved? On one hand, yes, we'd like to know the truth, and the capability exists to potentially answer some questions if we chose to pursue them. On the other hand, unsolved historical mysteries serve purposes. They inspire ongoing research and investigation. They remind us of the limits of knowledge and the persistence of uncertainty. They allow for multiple interpretations and ongoing scholarly debate. They also preserve something valuable, the sense of mystery and wonder that draws people to history in the first place. If every question had a definitive answer, history might be less engaging, less disputed, less alive as a field of inquiry. The disappeared medieval rulers remain disappeared, haunting us with their absence, challenging us with their mysteries. Modern technology offers some hope of resolution, but also reveals new dimensions of uncertainty. We are perhaps closer to understanding what happened to them than ever before, yet still fundamentally uncertain. The mysteries endure, waiting for either resolution or acceptance of their unsolvability. As we near the end of our journey through the vanished realms of disappeared medieval rulers, let's reflect on what these mysteries mean, not just as historical puzzles, but as windows into how power, memory, and truth function in human societies. Medieval kings were among the most visible people in their societies. Their movements were documented, their actions recorded by chroniclers, their appearances at public ceremonies witnessed by crowds. They lived in a kind of perpetual spotlight, never truly alone, always observed. And yet, despite this visibility, they could vanish more completely than common people. This seems paradoxical, but it reveals something important about the nature of power and visibility. The visibility of kings was curated and controlled. Chronicles recorded what happened in public ceremonies, but might not record what happened behind closed doors. Official narratives could be manipulated to conceal inconvenient truths. The very mechanisms meant to document kings' lives could be used to obscure their deaths. Common people, paradoxically, were often harder to make disappear. They had families, neighbors, and communities who knew them personally and would notice and question their absence. They weren't valuable enough for powerful people to carefully orchestrate their vanishing. Their deaths were sad, but not politically significant. But kings were different. Their deaths were politically consequential, which meant powerful people had motives to control the narrative about those deaths. And the mechanisms of power that made them so visible in life could be used to make them invisible in death. We've seen repeatedly how disappeared rulers became more powerful in absence than they were in life. Sebastian became a messianic figure. Barbarossa became a sleeping emperor. Owen Glendower became an eternal symbol of Welsh resistance. The princes in the tower became innocent martyrs whose deaths condemned their alleged murderer across centuries. Why does absence create this kind of power? Several psychological and political mechanisms are at work. First, absence creates mystery, and mystery creates fascination. We're drawn to the unknown, to questions without answers. A king who lived and died normally is just history. a king who vanished mysteriously, is a story that never ends. Second, absence allows projection. When we don't know what happened to someone, we can imagine it however we like. We can make them into heroes or martyrs, victims or survivors, symbols of whatever we want them to represent. Their very absence makes them mutable, adaptable to changing political and cultural needs. Third, absence creates possibility. As long as a ruler's death isn't confirmed, they might return. This might is psychologically powerful. It offers hope, sustains resistance, and keeps alive possibilities that confirmed death would foreclose. Fourth, absence often creates sympathy. The disappeared tend to be remembered kindly, their flaws forgotten, their virtues emphasized. Death in mysterious circumstances often creates martyrs, even when the person's actual life was complicated or problematic. Throughout our exploration, we've seen how disappeared rulers became political tools long after their physical vanishing. Pretenders used the uncertainty created by disappearances to claim thrones. Political movements invoked disappeared rulers as symbols and rallying points. Legends of sleeping kings sustained hope during times of oppression or national humiliation. The disappeared became whatever their invokers needed them to be. Sebastian was invoked by Portuguese nationalists, Brazilian millenarians, and literary romantics, each group finding in his mysterious fate the symbolism they needed. Owen Glendower was claimed by Welsh nationalists, medieval romantics, and political reformers, all finding in his disappearance the meaning they sought. Even the princes in the Tower, innocent children who were almost certainly murdered, became tools in the Protestant propaganda against the Catholic Church, which supported Richard III, in the Tudor propaganda justifying their seizure of the throne, and in modern debates about historical revisionism and rehabilitation. The disappeared don't speak for themselves, so others speak for them, often saying more about the speaker's own times and concerns than about the historical figures themselves. The cases of disappeared medieval rulers reveal how truth, narrative, and power interact in complex ways. Official narratives, what governments and powerful institutions say happened, aren't always true. We've seen this repeatedly. The official story about the princes in the Tower was almost certainly false or incomplete. The official story about Sebastian's body might have been mistaken. The official silence about Owen Glendower concealed whatever truth there was. But alternative narratives aren't automatically true either. The legends of Sebastian's survival were almost certainly false. The pretenders claiming to be disappeared rulers were usually frauds. The romantic stories about Barbarossa sleeping in a mountain are mythology, not history. Truth exists somewhere between official narrative and romantic legend, but often we can't access it definitively. Power shapes what gets recorded and remembered, but it can't completely control narrative. Gaps and contradictions allow for alternative stories, even if those alternatives are also partly or wholly false. This leaves us in a position of fundamental uncertainty about some historical events, an uncertainty that no amount of investigation can fully resolve. We must accept that some truths are simply lost, and that our narratives about the past are always partial, contested, and shaped by present concerns as much as historical evidence. Disappeared rulers also teach us about how societies remember and forget. Some disappearances, like the princes in the Tower, are remembered intensely for centuries, generating ongoing investigation, debate, and cultural production. Other disappearances, there are surely medieval rulers who vanished whom we don't even know about, are completely forgotten, erased not just physically, but from memory itself. What determines which disappearances are remembered? Several factors. Political significance. Disappearances that had major political consequences tend to be remembered. The princes in the Tower sparked succession crises and influenced English politics for generations. They're remembered. Obscure nobles who vanished but whose disappearances didn't change anything are forgotten. Cultural resonance. Disappearances that can be made symbolically meaningful, that fit cultural narratives about martyrdom, resistance, or national identity, tend to be remembered. Owen Glendower fits Welsh narratives of resistance to English oppression. He's remembered. Other Welsh nobles who also disappeared don't fit the narrative as well. They're forgotten. Documentary survival. We remember the disappearances that were recorded in sources that survived.
If no chronicle mentioned a disappearance, we have no way to know it happened. The randomness of which documents survive shapes which disappearances we remember. Romantic appeal. Frankly, some disappearances make better stories than others. Princes murdered in a tower is a compelling narrative. A king who drowned in a river and became a sleeping emperor is romantic. These stories persist partly because they're good stories, regardless of their historical importance. Our modern attempts to solve these medieval mysteries raise ethical questions. Should we disturb historic burials to satisfy historical curiosity? Should we deploy expensive modern technology to investigate events from centuries ago when modern problems need attention? Should we risk destroying cherished legends by proving them false? These aren't easy questions. Different people weigh the values differently. Some argue that truth matters, that we have an obligation to pursue historical knowledge wherever it leads, and that the remains of the long dead can't be harmed by respectful scientific investigation. Others argue that the dead deserve rest, that cultural narratives and legends have value even if historically inaccurate, and that resources should be directed to helping living people rather than investigating dead ones. Both positions have merit. The debate itself reveals something important. Our relationship to the disappeared is still active and contested. They may be gone, but they're not done shaping our world. How we choose to investigate or not investigate their fates says as much about our values and priorities as about theirs.
Our journey through these disappearances has taught us several important lessons. First, power is precarious. Even the most powerful people can vanish, and their power offers no ultimate protection against violence, uncertainty, or being forgotten. Second, truth is elusive. What actually happened in these cases may never be definitively known. We must live with uncertainty and construct our narratives knowing they're incomplete and contestable. Third, absence has its own power. The disappeared haunt history in ways that the normally dead don't. Their vanishing creates space for legend, projection, and ongoing political use. Fourth, memory is selective and political. What we remember and how we remember it reflects our values and concerns as much as historical reality. Fifth, investigation has limits. Even modern technology can't answer all questions, and we must decide whether pursuing answers is worth the various costs involved. Ultimately, disappeared medieval rulers leave us with an eternal question. What happened to them? For some, we have probable answers that we can never quite confirm. For others, we have only mysteries that deepen the more we investigate. These questions persist across centuries. Where are the princes in the tower buried? Did Sebastian really die at Alcacer Kabir? Where is Owen Glendower's grave? When did he actually die? The questions endure because the disappeared left gaps in history that we want to fill, mysteries that we want to solve, uncertainties that we want to resolve. But perhaps the questions themselves are the real legacy. They keep us engaged with the past, keep us questioning official narratives, keep us remembering people and events that might otherwise be forgotten. The disappeared medieval rulers are gone, but they're not absent. They haunt our history books, our cultural memory, our ongoing debates about truth and power. They're present in their absence, powerful in their powerlessness, alive in their death or disappearance. They remind us that the past is never really past, that mysteries can endure for centuries, and that sometimes the most important historical figures are those who left us not with answers, but with questions. Questions that echo across time, waiting for resolution or acceptance, demanding our attention precisely because they vanished without trace. We've journeyed together through 500 years and across Europe, following the traces of rulers who left no traces, investigating mysteries that remain unsolved centuries later. We've met princes who disappeared into towers, kings who vanished in battle, rebels who faded into legend, and emperors who became myths. Now, as our investigation draws to a close, let's reflect on what these disappearances mean for our understanding of history, power,
and truth.
In our modern age, we're accustomed to having answers. We have forensics, databases, surveillance, digital records. When someone disappears today, vast resources are deployed to find them. Most disappearances are solved, most bodies found, most mysteries resolved. But medieval disappearances remind us that this hasn't always been true, and perhaps it still isn't always true even now. Some questions have no answers. Some mysteries cannot be solved no matter how much we investigate. And sometimes, the absence of answers is itself historically significant. The disappeared medieval rulers teach us to be comfortable with uncertainty, to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge, to resist the temptation to construct false certainties when we should admit we don't know. This epistemic humility is valuable, not just for understanding the past, but for navigating our own present. Behind every mysterious disappearance is a human story. The princes in the tower were children. Edward was 12, Richard was 9. They played games, felt fear, hoped to survive. Their last moments, whatever they were experienced by real children, not just historical symbols. Owen Glendower was a man who lived into his 50s or 60s, who fought for years for a cause he believed in, who eventually had to face the reality that his rebellion had failed. His final years, whatever they entailed, were lived by a real person, dealing with defeat, aging, and mortality. King Sebastian was a young man of 24, whose religious fervor and military ambition led him to a battlefield in Morocco. His final moments, whether he died fighting or drowned fleeing, were experienced by a real person who had dreams, fears, and the sudden realization that his crusade had failed catastrophically. It's easy to get lost in the mystery and forget the human reality. These weren't just historical puzzles. They were people whose lives ended in circumstances we can't fully know, leaving loved ones without closure, questions without answers. Throughout our exploration, we've seen that being a medieval ruler was extraordinarily dangerous. Of our case studies, all met mysterious or violent ends. This isn't coincidental. Medieval politics was brutal, succession disputes were deadly, and wearing a crown made you a target. The disappeared rulers remind us that power came with terrible costs. Yes, kings had wealth, authority, and privilege, but they also lived under constant threat, trusted almost no one, and often met untimely ends. The crown was quite literally heavy. It weighed on those who wore it, until it crushed them. This historical reality should make us think differently about power. We often envy the powerful, imagining their lives as unalloyed privilege. But medieval rulers show us that power and vulnerability go together, that being at the top makes you the most visible target, that authority and danger are inseparable. These disappearances have been used and misused throughout subsequent history for various political and cultural purposes. We've seen how the princes in the tower were invoked in Tudor propaganda against Richard III. King Sebastian became a messianic figure for Portuguese nationalism. Owen Glendower became a symbol of Welsh identity and resistance. Frederick Barbarossa became a symbol of German unity and power. This instrumental use of history, taking historical figures and events and deploying them for present purposes, is inevitable and not necessarily wrong. The past is always interpreted through the present. We can't help but bring our current concerns to our understanding of history. But we should be aware that we're doing it. When we invoke disappeared rulers for modern purposes, we should acknowledge that we're constructing narratives that serve our needs, not necessarily accurately representing historical reality. The disappeared are easy to use because their very absence makes them malleable. We can make them into whatever we need them to be. Despite all our investigation, we still don't definitively know.
What happened to the princes in the tower? Who killed them if they were killed? Or even whether the bones in Westminster Abbey are really theirs? Whether King Sebastian's body was correctly identified, or whether he died exactly as reported? Where Owen Glendower died, when he died, or where he's buried? Where Frederick Barbarossa's remains actually ended up? These gaps in our knowledge are frustrating, but they're also honest. We don't know these things, and pretending we do would be false. The mysteries remain unsolved, and perhaps they'll remain unsolved forever. But acknowledging what we don't know is important. It prevents us from constructing false certainties, from believing narratives just because they're satisfying or politically useful, from mistaking speculation for fact. Even if we can't solve these mysteries definitively, the search for answers has value. Every investigation, every analysis, every new examination of evidence adds to our understanding, even if it doesn't provide final answers. We know more about the princes in the tower than we did a century ago, even if we still don't know exactly what happened to them. We understand the political context of King Sebastian's death better than previous generations did. We've mapped the possible locations of Owen Glendower's last years more thoroughly. The search itself is worthwhile, even when it doesn't lead to certainty. The process of investigation, questioning, and analysis is how we approach truth, even if we don't always reach it. Perhaps the final lesson from these disappeared medieval rulers is that we must learn to live with mystery, to accept that some questions have no answers, to be comfortable with uncertainty. This is difficult for modern people trained to expect resolution, to demand answers, to believe that every problem has a solution if we just apply enough technology and effort. But some problems don't have solutions. Some questions don't have answers. Some mysteries remain unsolved, not because we haven't tried hard enough, but because the truth is simply lost. The disappeared medieval rulers are gone beyond recovery. Their physical bodies, their final moments, their last words, these are lost to time, and no amount of modern technology or historical investigation can bring them back. What remains is the absence itself, the gap in the historical record, the unanswered questions, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the mystery is the message, that power is precarious, truth is elusive, and certainty is rarer than we'd like to believe.
We began this journey by imagining the impossible, the most visible, most protected, most documented people in medieval society simply vanishing without trace. We've seen that this wasn't impossible at all. It happened repeatedly to rulers across Europe, in different circumstances, but with similar results. We've learned that crisis creates opportunities for disappearance, that vulnerability makes vanishing easier, that distance obscures truth, and that political incentives can suppress information across centuries. We've seen how disappeared rulers often became more powerful in absence than they were in life, how their vanishing created space for legend and political use, how mystery itself became a form of historical agency. We've confronted the limits of modern technology and methods when faced with historical silence, and we've grappled with ethical questions about whether solving these mysteries is worth the costs involved. Most importantly, we've been reminded that history is not a settled record of known facts, but an ongoing conversation with an elusive past, a negotiation between evidence and interpretation, a discipline that requires both rigorous investigation and humble acceptance of what we cannot know. Thank you for joining me on this investigation into history's greatest disappearances. I hope these stories have fascinated you, challenged you to think about how we know what we know about the past, and perhaps given you a greater appreciation for the mysteries that endure across centuries. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into medieval mysteries, please subscribe to this channel for more explorations of history's hidden corners and unsolved cases. Share this video with others who appreciate historical mysteries,
And please, drop a comment below telling me which historical mystery you'd like us to investigate next. Your suggestions directly shape our content. Remember these disappeared rulers, the princes who entered a tower and never emerged, the king who rode into battle and was never found, the prince who faded into Welsh mist, the emperor who drowned in a river and supposedly never died. Remember that their disappearances changed history, created legends, and continue to challenge us across the centuries. Remember that the past is never fully known, that powerful people are not invulnerable, that truth can be lost, and that sometimes the most important historical figures are those who left us not with answers, but with questions. The medieval rulers who vanished are gone, but their absence remains, present in our curiosity, alive in our imagination, powerful in its very powerlessness. They remind us that history is as much about what we don't know as what we do, that mystery is part of the human experience across time, and that some crowns were lost so completely that even after centuries of searching, we still don't know where they fell. Until our next historical investigation, dear travelers through time, may you ask good questions, accept uncertain answers, and never stop seeking truth, even when it proves elusive. The day the kings disappeared, they stepped out of history and into legend, and there they remain, waiting for resolution or acceptance, haunting us with their absence, reminding us that power is fleeting, truth is fragile, and mystery is eternal. Good night, and thank you for searching with me for the kings who could not be found.